Today's scripture reading brings us to Romans chapter 15. Romans chapter 15, we're getting nigh into the end of this wonderful book, and I have this chapter divided into 5 sections, okay? The first 4 verses, I have that title, Bear One Another. Now, he speaks in the first 3 verses that we should be concerned about pleasing others rather than ourselves, and he uses Jesus as an example unto that. But then in verse number 4, Paul inadvertently, I don't even think did it on purpose, but inadvertently gives us the importance of Scripture. Verse number 4 says, "For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope." The Scriptures are given to us for our learning and for our hope. And man, as you go down through here, Paul quotes so much Scripture, especially in this next portion that we're going to give to you. Verses 5 through 13, I have that titled, Be United. Because prior to this, the majority of the entirety of this book, Paul is talking about the differences and the similarities between the Jew and the Gentile. And now as he's coming to a close, he's telling them, man, be united. Be united. Be in unity one with another. And he talks about the Jews and the Gentiles in verses 8 and 9. He says, "Now I say that Jesus Christ was a minister of the circumcision for the truth of God," talking to the Jews, to confirm the promises made unto the fathers, and that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy, as it is written. And then he goes on quoting Scripture. So he talks about the ministry unto the Jews and unto the Gentiles, and then he starts compounding it with Scripture. He quotes out of 2 Samuel and Psalms in verse number 9, Deuteronomy in verse number 10, Psalms in verse number 11, Isaiah in verse number 12. And so he's just packing it full of Scripture. Man, God help us that we live in a day and age to where some of the most recognizable faces in Christianity are telling us that the Bible is not necessary. I'm glad Paul did not have that mindset about him. But Paul used the Scriptures as the basis for everything in which he preached. So should we. Verses 14 through 21, I have that titled Paul's Ministry to the Gentiles. He begins detailing his ministry unto there. In verse number 16, one thing to notice is that it was given to him by grace. By the grace of God, Paul was called by God a Pharisee, one that was persecuting the church. He was doing no favors for God, and that's why it shows just the immense amount of God's grace bestowed upon him. This ministry was given by the grace of God, and then it was confirmed and wrought by the Spirit of God. We see that in verses 16 through 19. Verses 22 through 29 detail Paul's plans, what he intends to do from here on out. He is talking about how he wants to go there. He wants to take a journey into Spain, but first he has to go to Jerusalem and minister there and give this offering that he had collected for the Jews there in Jerusalem. And notice this, and that's verse number 27. It says, it hath pleased them verily, and their debtors they are. Speaking of the Gentiles, he said, for if the Gentiles have been made partakers of their spiritual things, their duty also is to minister unto them in carnal things. So Paul's telling them, listen, it's sitting in a one-way street. The Jews are being blessed by God. They've been engrafted in, he says, but they have a responsibility now to make sure that the church of God is taken care of. And then lastly, verses 30 and 33, and this is such an interesting few verses. And I'll tell you why. And it deserves a lot more time than what we can give it here. But I have that titled Paul's Prayer Request. In these verses, Paul gives a prayer request. And as you look down through here, he's praying. Let me just give you verse number 31. That I may be delivered from them that do not believe in Judea, and that my service which I have for Jerusalem may be accepted of the saints. Now it's stated or thought that this is written somewhere around 54, 55 BC, and this is right prior to Paul going back to Jerusalem and being apprehended and being arrested and then being carted off to Rome. And so there's really so much you can think about. Is this a prayer request that he asked that they may have prayed for, but it wasn't answered, or actually it was answered in a way, because Paul would go back to Rome. But then you see here in verse number 32, he says that I may come unto you with joy by the will of God, and may with you be refreshed. Well, as Paul was going back, he's writing this, God was telling him, this is not my will. And he went anyway. So like I said, there's just so much here that you could really just chew on and think about as you consider all of the things that were going on during this time. So that's it, 5 sections in chapter 15. Do not forget that I know our reading today is 15 and 16. Chapter 16 will be in the next video. Make sure that you check that out. All right, God bless you, and we'll look forward to seeing you then.